Welcome to Shadow Slave, an audiobook narrative adaptation of the web novel written by Guilty 3. This is not a word-for-word reading of the original text. It is a retelling, rewritten for the ear, shaped for the listener, and crafted to pull you fully into the world of the nightmare spell. The story, the characters, and every event belong entirely to the original author. This is simply a different way to experience them. Now, let the nightmare begin. A frail young man sat on a rusty bench across from the police station, cradling a cup of coffee in both hands. Not the cheap synthetic kind slum rats like him were used to. Real coffee. Plant-based, imported, the kind reserved for citizens of a higher rank. It had cost most of his savings. But today, Sonny had decided to pamper himself. After all, his life was coming to an end. He raised the cup and savored the aroma, then took a careful sip and immediately grimaced. Ah, so bitter. He stared at the cup with open contempt, then forced himself to drink more. Bitter or not, he was getting his money's worth. Taste buds be damned. I should have bought real meat instead. Who knew actual coffee was this disgusting? Well, at least it'll keep me awake. He stared into the distance, eyelids drooping, then slapped himself across the face. Tch, what a rip-off. Sonny finished the last of it and stood. The wealthy residents of this part of the city streamed past the small park on their way to work, shooting him strange looks. Haggard, pale, dressed in cheap clothes and running on no sleep, he was clearly out of place, and everyone seemed so tall. He tossed the cup at a garbage bin. It missed by a wide margin, bounced off the rim and landed on the ground. Sonny rolled his eyes, walked over, and carefully placed it in the trash. Then, with a faint grin, he crossed the street and walked into the police station. Inside, a tired-looking officer gave him a quick once-over and frowned. "Are you lost, boy?" Sonny glanced around with mild curiosity, noting the reinforced armor plating on the walls and the poorly hidden turret nests in the ceiling. The officer himself looked mean and scruffy. At least police stations were the same everywhere. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Sonny cleared his throat. No." He scratched the back of his head. "As required by the third special directive, I am here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell." The officer's expression shifted, irritation giving way to something sharper, more wary. He looked Sonny over again, this time with real intensity. "Are you sure you're infected? When did the symptoms start?" Sonny shrugged. "About a week ago?" The officer visibly paled. "Shit." He slammed a button on his terminal and bellowed at the top of his lungs. "Attention! Code black in the lobby. I repeat, code black." The nightmare spell had first appeared in the world several decades ago, during a time when the planet was still struggling to recover from a string of devastating natural disasters and the resource wars that followed. At first, a new disease causing fatigue and excessive sleepiness drew little concern, but when the infected began to fall into a deep, unnatural slumber, one they could not wake from even days later, governments finally panicked. By then, it was too late. Not that an early response would have changed much. When the infected started dying in their sleep, their bodies rising as monsters, no one was ready. Nightmare creatures overwhelmed national militaries with terrifying speed, plunging the world into chaos. In the end, it was the awakened, those who survived the spell's first trials and returned alive, who put a stop to the rampage. Armed with powers earned in their nightmares, they restored a semblance of order from the wreckage. For most people, the spell was as much a risk as an opportunity. Children learned survival skills and combat techniques in school on the chance of one day being infected. Wealthy families hired private tutors and martial arts instructors. Those from awakened clans had access to inherited memories and echoes, powerful relics ready for use from the moment they entered the dream realm. The richer you were, the better your odds of surviving and becoming something more. But Sonny had no family to speak of. He had spent most of his life scrounging for food instead of attending school. For someone like him, being chosen by the spell was not an opportunity. It was a death sentence. A few minutes later, Sonny was yawning while several officers strapped him into a bulky chair.
somewhere between a hospital bed and a torture device. The basement room had thick armored walls and a heavy vault door. Officers stood along the walls, rifles in hand, expressions grim. Sonny barely noticed them. The only thing on his mind was how desperately he wanted to sleep. The vault door opened, and a gray-haired policeman stepped in. His face was weathered, his eyes stern, the look of a man who had seen too many terrible things and simply kept going. He checked the restraints, glanced at his watch, then turned to Sonny. "What's your name, kid?" Sonny blinked a few times, trying to focus. "Sunless." The old man raised an eyebrow. "Sunless? That's a strange name." Sonny tried to shrug, but couldn't move. "What's strange about it? At least I have one. Back in the outskirts, not everyone gets a name." He yawned. "I was born during a solar eclipse. My mother had a poetic soul." That was why he ended up with this name, and why his little sister had been called Rain back when she still lived with them. The old policeman grunted. "Do you want me to contact your family?" Sonny shook his head. "There's no one. Don't bother." A shadow crossed the policeman's face. Then his expression turned serious. "All right, Sunless. How long can you stay awake?" "Not long." The man sighed. "Then we don't have time for the full procedure. Resist as long as you can and listen carefully." He didn't wait for a response. "How much do you know about the nightmare spell?" Sonny gave him a slow look. "As much as anyone, I suppose. Who doesn't know about the spell?" "Not what you see in dramas or hear in the broadcasts. I mean what you actually know." That was harder to answer. "Don't I just enter the dream realm, kill some monsters, finish the first nightmare, and become an awakened?" The old man shook his head. "Listen, once you fall asleep, you'll be transported into your first nightmare. Nightmares are trials. Inside, you'll face monsters, but also people. Remember this, they are not real. They are illusions conjured to test you." "How do you know that?" The policeman stared at him without blinking. "I mean, no one truly understands what the spell is, right? So how can you be certain they're not real?" "Because you might have to kill them, kid. So do yourself a favor and just think of them as illusions." "Oh." The old man waited a beat, then continued. "A lot of what happens in the first nightmare depends on luck. Generally, it shouldn't be overwhelmingly difficult. The situation, the tools, the creatures, they should all fall within the range of what you can handle. The spell creates trials, not executions." He paused. "You're at a disadvantage given your circumstances, but kids from the outskirts are tough. Don't give up on yourself just yet." Sonny was barely keeping his eyes open. The policeman's voice was growing distant. "About those powers you mentioned, you'll receive them if you survive. What they are depends on your natural affinity and what you do during the trial, but some will be available to you from the start. The first thing you must do once you're inside is check your attributes and your aspect. If you receive a combat aspect, something like swordsman or archer, things will be easier. A physical attribute alongside it is even better. Combat aspects are the most common, so the odds are in your favor." The armored room was dimming around him. "If your aspect has nothing to do with combat, don't despair. Sorcery and utility aspects have their own strengths. You just have to be smart about it. There are no truly useless aspects. Well, almost none. So do whatever it takes to survive." The voice seemed to come from very far away now. "If you survive, you'll be halfway to becoming an awakened. But if you die, you'll open a gate and a nightmare creature will enter the real world, which means my colleagues and I will have to deal with it. So please don't die, Sunless." Already half gone, Sonny felt a faint warmth at those words. "Or at least try not to die right away. The nearest awakened won't arrive for several hours. We'd really appreciate not having to fight that thing ourselves." What? With that last half-formed thought, Sonny slipped into a deep slumber. Everything went black. And then, from somewhere in that darkness, a faintly familiar voice rang out. A presence settled into his mind, vast, certain, and impossible to ignore. "Welcome," it seemed to say. "Your first trial is about to begin." Sonny dreamed of a mountain, jagged and immense. It dwarfed every other peak in the chain, cutting the night sky with its sharp silhouette. A pale moon bathed its slopes in ghostly silver light. Along one of those slopes, the remnants of an old road clung stubbornly to the rock. Weathered stone paving pushed through the snow in uneven patches. To the right, a sheer cliff face rose like an impregnable wall. To the left, a silent black void fell away into nothing. Strong winds crashed against the mountain again and again, howling in powerless fury. Then the moon dropped below the horizon. The sun rose from the west, streaked across the sky, and vanished in the east. Snowflakes leapt from the ground and dissolved into clouds. Time was moving in reverse, fast, then faster. Hundreds of years compressed in an instant. Snow retreated, bearing the old road beneath. Human bones littered the exposed ground. Then they vanished too, and in their place appeared a slave caravan lurching backward down the mountain, chains clattering. Time slowed, stopped, and resumed.
The voice returned, settled into him like something that had always been there, waiting. Step, step, another step. A dull ache radiated through Sonny's bleeding feet. His threadbare tunic offered nothing against the biting wind. His wrists were the worst, raw and broken where iron shackles bit into the skin, sending a sharp jolt of pain with every movement. He looked up and down the road. A long chain stretched ahead and behind, with dozens of hollow-eyed people shackled to it at regular intervals. In front of him, a broad-shouldered man walked with grim, measured steps. Behind, a shifty-looking man with quick, desperate eyes cursed quietly under his breath in a language Sonny didn't know, but somehow still understood. Armed horsemen in ancient-style armor moved past them periodically, throwing menacing glances at the slaves. However you looked at it, things were very bad. Sonny was more bewildered than panicked. This was nothing like what the first nightmare was supposed to be. Usually, newly infected aspirants found themselves with some degree of agency, placed in a privileged role, given access to weapons, given at least a fighting chance. Starting as a shackled slave, half dead and powerless, was about as far from ideal as a situation could get. Still, the spell was built on challenge and balance. Trials, not executions, as the old policeman had said. Sonny was fairly certain that the worse the starting conditions, the better the reward. A powerful aspect at least. He focused, and shimmering runes appeared in the air before him, ancient letters whose meaning settled into his mind without effort. He found the rune describing his aspect, and finally lost his composure. His name, Sunless. His rank, Aspirant. His attributes, Fated, Mark of Divinity, Child of Shadows. His aspect, Temple Slave. The description beneath it read, "Slave is a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worth a mention. A temple slave is just the same, except much rarer." Sonny stared at the runes, willing himself to have misread them. Surely he couldn't be that unlucky. No useless aspects, the policeman had said. He lost the rhythm of his steps and stumbled, pulling the chain down with his weight. Immediately, the man behind him screamed, "Whores, bastard! Watch where you're going!" Sonny dismissed the runes, visible only to him, and scrambled to recover his balance. A moment later, he was walking steadily again, though not before jerking the chain a second time. "You little shit! I'm gonna kill you!" The broad-shouldered man ahead chuckled without turning around. Why bother? The weakling will be dead by sunrise. The mountain will take care of him. A pause.
It'll take the rest of us too, just a little later. I genuinely don't understand what the Imperials are thinking, pushing us through this cold." The shifty man behind Sonny gasped indignantly. "Speak for yourself, fool! I intend to survive." Sonny silently shook his head and focused on not falling again. What a charming pair. A third voice joined from somewhere further back, calm and strangely intelligent. "This pass is usually much warmer this time of year. We simply had very bad luck. I would also advise you against harming this boy." "Why is that?" "Haven't you seen the markings on his skin? He is not like us who fell into slavery through debt or crime or misfortune. He was born a slave, a temple slave specifically. Not long ago, the Empire destroyed the last temple of the Shadow God. I suspect that is how this boy ended up among us." The broad-shouldered man looked back. "So what? Why should we fear some half-forgotten weakling god? He couldn't even protect his own temples." "The Empire is shielded by the War God. They can afford to burn temples, but we are protected by nothing and no one. Do you really want to risk angering a god?" The broad-shouldered man said nothing. Their conversation ended as a young soldier rode past on a white horse, clad in simple leather armor, armed with a spear and a short sword. He looked dignified, composed, and, to Sonny's considerable irritation, extremely handsome. In any historical drama, this man would have been the male lead without a question. What is going on here? There was no menace in his voice. If anything, he sounded concerned. When the others hesitated, the gentle-voiced slave answered, "Nothing, sir. We are tired and cold, that is all. Especially our young companion. This journey is quite hard for someone his age." The soldier looked at Sonny with something resembling pity. "What are you looking at? You're not much older than me." Sonny thought it, said nothing. The soldier sighed, unclipped a flask from his belt, and held it out. "Bear with it a little longer, child. We will camp soon. Here, drink something." Child? Sonny was small for his age, and years of poor nutrition hadn't helped. People often assumed he was younger than he was. He usually found ways to use that to his advantage. Right now, for some reason, it irritated him deeply. Still, he was very thirsty. He reached for the flask, and then a whip cracked through the air, and the world turned into pain. He stumbled, jerking the chain again, drawing another curse from behind. An older soldier had pulled his horse to a stop a few paces back, the whip that had torn through Sonny's tunic and drawn blood still in his hand. Without sparing the slaves a glance, the man fixed the younger soldier with a cold, contemptuous stare. "What do you think you're doing?" The young soldier's jaw tightened. "I was giving the boy some water. He'll get water with the rest of them when we make camp." "But—"
Shut your mouth. These slaves are not your friends. They are not even people. Treat them like people and they'll start imagining things. The young soldier looked at Sonny, then slowly lowered his head and put the flask away. "Don't let me catch you making friends with slaves again, newbie. Next time it'll be your back that tastes the whip." The older soldier cracked it once more for emphasis, then rode past, trailing anger and menace. Sonny watched him go with carefully hidden contempt. "I don't know how yet, but I will watch you die first." He turned and glanced at the younger soldier, now falling behind with his head still bowed. "And you second." For a few minutes after that, Sonny's mood was dark. Then he drew a long breath and let it go. The air here was extraordinary, clean and cold and genuinely delicious, the kind of air that simply did not exist in the real world. Back home, microdust and pollution made every breath rough. In the wealthier districts, filtration systems kept the air breathable but sterile. Only the truly rich had access to anything close to this. And here he was, breathing like a second-generation chaibal with a mountain estate. There were worse ways to spend your last few hours. If only the cold weren't so brutal. If only his feet didn't ache and his wrists and back weren't in agony. The slave caravan dragged itself slowly upward. More and more people stumbled. Some fell and couldn't rise. When that happened, the soldiers removed them from the chain and tossed them off the road's left edge into the abyss below. Sonny watched them go with a quiet pang. Poor souls. Rest well. All things considered, though, he was in good spirits. He was strange to feel this way inside a disaster of a nightmare, but Sonny had time to prepare. When the spell's symptoms first appeared, he had not handled it well. Dying before 17 was not something anyone could easily accept. But it had only taken him a few days to make peace with it. He had visited his parents' makeshift resting place, not a proper remembrance facility, which he couldn't afford, just 2 lines carved into an old tree, and added a 3rd line for himself. After that, a strange calm had settled over him. There was nothing left to worry about. No money to earn, no food to hunt, no future to plan for. Once the worst possible thing had already happened, what was left to fear? Becoming a slave, freezing on a mountain, none of it was much of a shock. Besides, Sonny already knew that cold would not kill him. He had seen the bones buried under the snow in his vision at the start of the nightmare. Whatever had killed the caravan wasn't the mountain. It was something else, something that would arrive within hours, not days. He still had a chance. He summoned the runes again and studied his attributes more carefully. The first, Fated, he quickly recognized as the culprit behind his abysmal luck. At first glance, it suggested destiny, but reading it again, he realized it simply meant improbable events were drawn to him, good and bad alike, which explained how he had managed to receive one of the rarest and most useless aspects in existence. The second, Mark of Divinity, was more or less clear. It would allow passage into certain sacred places in the dream realm and enhance some forms of sorcery. Since there were no sacred places nearby, and his aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, it was presently useless. The third, Child of Shadows, was stranger. He had never encountered it before, and he had no idea what it did. Then the sun dipped behind the mountain, and the sky began to darken. And Sonny found he could see perfectly. The shadows offered no obstruction. It was as though nothing had changed at all. He turned slowly, taking in the dark road with eyes that cut through it effortlessly. This alone was not nothing, and something told him shadows might offer more surprises before the night was done. Stop the caravan, prepare to camp. At the head soldier's command, the line shuddered to a halt. Slaves collapsed to the ground, shivering and spent. The clearing where the road widened offered some shelter from the wind. A rocky outcrop broke the worst of it, but the cold was still merciless. The soldiers set to work, herding the slaves into a tight circle and lighting a large bonfire in the center. They tended their horses first. The heavy wagon at the head of the chain was pushed sideways to cut the wind. Nearby, the young soldiers stood at the edge of the camp, watching the mountain with a look Sonny couldn't quite read. Strange man. The slaves closest to the fire scrambled to claim that warmth. The weaker ones, Sonny among them, were forced to the outer edge of the circle, their backs exposed to the cold. The chain made movement difficult, which meant the broad-shouldered man ended up right where he started despite his considerable efforts to push closer to the flames. Damn Imperials. Soldiers moved through the crowd distributing food and water. Sonny received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of hard, moldy bread. He ate the whole thing. It left him hungry as before. He wasn't alone in that. The shifty slave looked around with barely contained a despair. By all the gods, they fed me better in the dungeons, and most of us waiting in the dungeon were there on our way to the gallows. He spat on the ground. A short distance away, where the paved road gave way to jagged rock, bright red berries clustered in the snow. They had grown here and there along the road, and Sonny had noticed them before, vivid against the white, almost beautiful in a grim way. The shifty slave's eyes locked onto them immediately. He began to crawl towards them on all fours. I would advise against eating those.
The gentle voice again. Sonny turned to see the speaker for the first time, a tall man in his 40s, lean and strangely dignified, with the bearing of a scholar. What a man like this was doing in chains was a mystery. You and your advice, why not? The scholar smiled apologetically. Those are called bloodbane. They grow where human blood has been spilled. That is why you find them clustered along slave trade routes. So what? Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries can kill an adult. The shifty slave recoiled as though burned and shot the scholar a furious glare. Sonny had already stopped paying attention to them, because he had just recognized the camp's location. This was the place, the same clearing he had seen in his vision at the start of the nightmare, the one where the bones of the slaves would eventually be buried under the snow, which meant whatever had killed them was coming soon. A thundering noise split the air from above, and in the next second something enormous came crashing from the sky. The noise arrived before anything else, a deep rumbling crack from somewhere above the road. Many of the slaves looked up in time to see rocks and heavy chunks of ice raining from the heights above. Panic took hold instantly. They lurched and screamed, the chain tangling between them as some fell and dragged others down with them. Sonny was one of the few who stayed upright. He had expected this. Calm and unhurried, he watched the sky with his shadow-sharpened eyes and took one deliberate step back. A second later, a chunk of ice the size of a man's torso struck the ground directly in front of him and shattered, spraying sharp fragments in every direction. Others weren't so fortunate. Ice and stone continued to fall. People were wounded, some fatally. The night filled with wailing. "On your feet! Move to the wall!" The veteran soldier shouted orders, trying to drive the slaves toward the relative shelter of the mountain slope. But before anyone could move, something massive impacted the stone platform, sending a tremor through the ground that knocked people off their feet. It landed between the caravan and the mountain wall, and for a moment everything went silent. It looked at first like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round, about the height of a mounted horseman. Then it unfolded its limbs and rose, and Sonny's breath caught. At least 4 meters tall. 2 stumpy legs supported an emaciated, hunched torso. 2 enormous limbs ended in sets of horrifying bone claws. 2 shorter arms hung below them, ending in fingers that looked almost human. What had appeared to be snow was actually fur, yellowish-gray, ragged, thick enough to turn away arrows and blades. 5 milky white eyes surveyed the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a half-open maw crowded with razor-sharp teeth glistened with viscous drool. And beneath the skin, shapes moved, slow, worm-like, ceaseless. Sonny was close enough to see it clearly, and wished he wasn't. All hell broke loose at once. The creature swept one massive arm in a wide arc. Sonny was already moving. He jumped sideways with everything the chain allowed, positioning the broad-shouldered slave neatly beneath himself in the blow. The claws, each one as long as a sword, tore through the man a fraction of a second later. A wave of hot blood followed. Drenched and blinded, Sonny hit the ground. The corpse landed on top of him. "Damn, why are you so heavy?" He heard the creature's howl, felt a vast shadow pass overhead, and then the screaming around him swelled into a chorus. He shoved at the dead man, trying to roll him off, but the chain lurched violently and wrenched his wrists with blinding pain. He was dragged several steps before it slackened, and he got control of his hands again. Things could be worse. Pushing against the corpse with both palms, he finally managed to roll it sideways and pull himself free. Then his blood went cold. Beneath his hands, still pressed against the dead man's chest, something was moving under the skin. "You just had to think it, didn't you, idiot?" Sonny scrambled backward as far as the chain allowed, 1.5 meters, no more. The corpse had begun to convulse. Bone growths pierced the skin, rising like spikes. Muscles bulged and twisted, reshaping from beneath. Fingernails darkened and lengthened into claws. The face cracked apart, revealing a twisted maw lined with rows of needle-like fangs. Across the body, the shifty slave stared with his jaw hanging open. "Stop staring! Move away from it!" He tried and fell. The chain was pinned under the corpse's weight, tangling all 3 of them. Sonny clenched his teeth. This was wrong. Not just in the obvious sense, wrong by the rules of the nightmare itself. The spell had its own hierarchy of creatures. Beasts and monsters populated first nightmares. Demons rarely. Nothing stronger than a devil had ever been reported in one. But the creature before him had just spawned a lesser version of itself. That ability belonged to tyrants, the 5th class, and those above them. What was a tyrant doing in a first nightmare? How powerful was his fated attribute? There was no time to dwell on it. The broad-shouldered slave,
What was left of him slowly rose. Its new mouth produced strange clicking sounds. Before it could fully orient itself, Sonny cursed under his breath and lunged forward, grabbing a length of slack chain. One of the creature's arms shot towards him. Sonny sidestepped it with a single calculated movement. He had no fighting techniques. His childhood was the street, not a school. But the street had been its own education. Years of fighting to survive had left him with one reliable skill, a clear head when everything else was chaos. So he didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. He stepped close, threw the chain around the creature's shoulders, and pulled, pinning its arms to the body. Before the thing could recover from its own sluggish transformation, he wrapped the chain around it again and again, barely pulling his face out of reach of those snapping fangs. The arms were pinned, but the length of chain he had used was gone, leaving him pressed almost against the creature, with almost no room to move. "You two!" he screamed back at the shifty slave and the scholar. "Pull on that chain like your lives depend on it!" Because they did.
They gaped at him, then understood. Each grabbed the chain from opposite sides and hauled with everything they had. The creature flexed its muscles, fighting to break free. The chain groaned, catching on the bone spikes, beginning to give. Sonny threw his arms up and caught the creature's neck with the thinner chain linking his shackles. He circled it in a quick step, ended up back to back with it, and pulled, using his own spine as a lever and every kilogram of his body as counterweight. He wasn't strong enough to strangle a man bare-handed. A mutant tyrant larva was another matter entirely, but this way he at least had a chance. He pulled down with everything he had. The creature thrashed. Bone spikes raked his skin. The chain at his wrists groaned and bit deep. Behind him, the shifty slave and the scholar kept the tension, straining against it. Now it was just a question of what broke first. Die! Die, you bastard! Sweat and blood rolled down his face. His strength was nearly gone. His wounded back, wrists, and skin were screaming at him. Every second felt like it might be the last he had left to give. And then the creature went still. A moment passed, and from somewhere a voice settled into him like light breaking through water. Quiet, certain, enormously welcome. He had slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva. Sonny dropped to his knees, breathless. His entire body felt like it had been run through a grinder. Adrenaline could only carry a person so far, and he had long since spent his share. And yet, beneath the pain, beneath the exhaustion, there was a fierce, bright satisfaction. He had killed the larva. He had actually killed it. He even forgot to be disappointed about the memory he hadn't received. A magic sword would have been useful right now, even a warm coat. 3 seconds, he told himself. You can rest for exactly 3 seconds. He forced himself upright and looked around. The larva was dead. The chain still connected him to it, and the shifty slave and the scholar were busy untangling the links to buy the three of them some freedom of movement. Further out, the platform was strewn with torn bodies and worse. Many slaves had been killed. A few had broken free and were running into the darkness. Fools, they're signing their own death warrants. At some point during the chaos, the main chain had snapped. That was why it had gone slack when Sonny was being dragged. Without a way to unlock the shackles themselves, though, none of them were going anywhere. The locks were keyed individually, fixed to specific links. The tyrant, Mountain King, presumably, was somewhere on the far side of the bonfire, hidden behind its bright glow, but Sonny could feel its movements in the tremors coming up through the stone, and he could hear the screams of those still alive over there. The occasional enraged bellow suggested that at least some of the soldiers were still fighting. Then he noticed the bodies. Several of the maimed corpses had begun to move. One by one, 4 more larvae rose to their feet. Each was as grotesque as the first, and not a degree less dangerous. The nearest was only meters away. He wanted, very much, to wake up. Clicking sounds filled the air. The nearest beast turned its head toward the 3 slaves, gnashed its fangs, and started moving. The shifty slave landed on his back with a whispered prayer. The scholar froze. Sonny's eyes swept the ground for anything he could use as a weapon. There was nothing. He wrapped a length of chain around his knuckles and raised his fists. Come on, then.
The larva lunged, a blur of claws and fangs and terrifying speed. Sunny had less than a second. Then a figure moved past him and a sword flashed. The larva dropped without a sound, headless, already still. Sunny blinked. He turned slowly. Standing to his left, sword drawn, expression calm and composed, was the young soldier who had once tried to give him water. Not a mark on his leather armor, not a speck of blood. He is awesome. Sunny caught himself. He's a poser, total poser. With a brief nod, the soldier moved to face the remaining 3 larvae. Then, a few steps out, he stopped and turned back. He held Sunny's gaze for a moment, then reached to his belt, drew something short and narrow, and tossed it across the gap between them. "Save yourself." And he was gone, moving to meet the monsters. Sunny caught the object reflexively and looked down. A short iron rod, narrow with a straight bend at the end. A key. The key to the shackles. His heart lurched into a faster rhythm. With one glance at the fierce battle erupting between the soldier and the larvae, Sunny dropped to one knee and began working the shackles, fumbling to find the right angle. It took several tries to understand the mechanism, and then a satisfying click, and his wrists were free. Cold wind touched the raw skin where the iron had been. He rubbed his wrists and let a slow, dark smile settle on his face. Just you wait. For a moment, vivid thoughts of violence and repayment filled his head. "Boy, over here!" The shifty slave was waving urgently. Sunny briefly considered leaving him, then decided against it. Numbers were strength, and despite the threats and the general unpleasantness, he couldn't bring himself to leave a man in chains when freeing him cost nothing. He moved quickly, unlocking the shifty slave's shackles and then the scholar's. The moment he was free, the shifty slave shoved Sunny aside and broke into a little dance, laughing like a man who had lost his mind. "Free! Gods must truly be smiling on us!" The scholar was quieter. He gripped Sunny's shoulder briefly, eyes tight with tension, and looked towards the fight. 2 of the remaining 3 larvae were already down. The third was missing an arm, but still pressing forward. The young soldier moved around it with fluid precision, graceful and practiced, like someone born to this. "What are we waiting for? Run!" The shifty slave made to bolt. The scholar caught his arm.
My friend, if you say advise one more time, I will bash your skull open myself." They stared at each other with thinly veiled contempt. Then the scholar looked away and sighed. "If we run, we die." "Why?" He pointed at the bonfire. "Without that fire, we freeze before morning. Running now is suicide." Sunny said nothing. He had reached the same conclusion the moment he finished strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was their only lifeline on this mountain. The broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had been right about that much. The mountain itself would kill them if they gave it the chance. The shifty slave glanced into the surrounding darkness and shivered. "So what are we supposed to do?" The 3rd larva was down. The young soldier had vanished, back to the other side of the bonfire, most likely, to face the tyrant itself. The scholar cleared his throat. "If the creature is already satisfied, the soldiers may yet drive it off. If we stay, there is a chance, however small. If we run, there is none." Sunny was not as optimistic. Mountain King would not be satiated with killing most of the caravan, and he didn't believe mortal soldiers could bring down a tyrant. But he had to deal with it somehow if he wanted to live. "Let's go look." The shifty slave stared at him like he had declared the sky was made of bread. "You want to get closer to that thing?" Sunny looked at him for a moment, said nothing, and turned toward the bonfire. He was facing a tyrant, a 5th-class nightmare creature, one of the most powerful categories that existed. The odds were not odds at all, they were a joke. Anyone who heard his intentions would have laughed him out of the room. But the alternative was worse, and he had already stopped having the energy to be afraid. On the far side of the bonfire, things were bad and getting worse. Most of the slaves were dead. The last few soldiers fought desperately, but they weren't going to last.
Even as Sonny watched, the tyrant reached down, lifted a dead slave still attached to the chain, and bit him in half. The bloodied stumps dropped back into the shackles. Mountain King's 5 milky eyes stared into nothing as it chewed. One of the surviving soldiers screamed and charged with a long spear. Without turning, the tyrant extended one of its shorter arms, caught the soldier's head in its grip, and squeezed. The body tumbled off the edge of the cliff and vanished into the abyss. Beside Sonny, the shifty slave doubled over and emptied his stomach, then shakily straightened and glared. "We've had our look, now what?" Sonny didn't answer. He was watching the tyrant with his head slightly tilted, thinking. The shifty slave turned to the scholar in exasperation. "The boy is sick in the head. How is he this calm?" "Shh! Lower your voice, fool." All the color drained from the shifty slave's face. He slapped a hand over his own mouth and shot a horrified glance at the creature. Fortunately, Mountain King was occupied with the remaining slaves, both the already dead and the not yet dead, and paid the 3 of them no attention. Sonny was running calculations. He had no special powers, no army, not even a weapon worth the name, so killing the creature himself was not an option. He moved his gaze past it, into the dark sky. Then a flash streaked through the air, the young soldier hurling a piece of wood at the tyrant's arm. It burst into a shower of sparks. He raised his sword defiantly. "Face me, devil!" A distraction, exactly what was needed, because Sonny had already decided he wasn't going to kill Mountain King with his own 2 hands. He was going to use something else entirely. Gravity. He couldn't do the creature in himself, so he would let the drop do it for him. "With me!" He was already moving, heading for the far end of the stone platform where the heavy supply wagon sat parked very close to the edge. Shifty and Scholar exchanged a glance, then followed, perhaps mistaking his calm for confidence, or perhaps operating on the widely accepted theory that madmen were often favored by the gods. Behind him, the young soldier ducked smoothly under the tyrant's claws and returned a slash with his sword. The blade slid harmlessly across the dense fur and left nothing behind. A heartbeat later, the creature moved with frightening speed, throwing all 4 limbs at his new irritant. Sonny was already at the wagon, checking for larvae, moving around to the rear wheels. The wagon was positioned at the upper end of the platform, where the stone narrowed back into road. It had been turned sideways to break the wind, its front face against the mountain wall, its back to the cliff's edge. 2 large wooden wedges were jammed beneath the rear wheels to keep it from rolling. He turned to the others. "When I say so, pull both wedges, then push, understand?" Blank stares. "Why?" The scholar looked from the wedges to the tyrant. He understood. Across the platform, the young soldier was somehow still alive, weaving between the creature's 4 arms with a fluid precision that bordered on impossible, always a half-second from total evisceration. His sword flashed periodically, useless against the hide, but the young warrior didn't slow. There was a first trace of apprehension on his face. Every other soldier was already dead. "Don't die yet." To the shifty slave, Sonny simply said, "You'll see." Then he was moving again, following the chain back from its anchor point on the wagon's frame. What he was searching for was hidden under bodies and blood and worse, but luck held. He found the torn end of the main chain. He located the nearest set of shackles, still locked around a dead man, dropped to his knees, and began working with the key. A muffled impact. He glanced sideways. The young soldier had been caught by a blow and was airborne. Impossibly, he landed on his feet, sliding several meters before stopping. All his limbs intact, no terrible wounds. Without pausing, he rolled forward to reclaim his sword, then rolled sideways to avoid a thundering stomp. Rolling? Who rolls in a situation like this? No time. Sonny finally got the shackles open, shook the dead man free, and locked them again, this time around the chain itself, an emme slipknot, a loop that could tighten. Everything now depended on steady hands, a clear eye, and a measure of luck he had not yet determined he possessed. He turned to the others still waiting at the wagon. Now! He lifted a length of chain, stood, and faced the tyrant.
The young soldier glanced at him for half a second. His eyes followed the chain to the wagon. Then he turned back to the creature and doubled his efforts, pulling all ounce of its attention onto himself. He is smart, too. What an absolute scam. Sonny cleared his head. He focused on the weight in his hands, the distance to the fight, and the target. Time seemed to slow just slightly. Please don't miss. He gathered every last fragment of strength, spun and released the chain in a wide arc, like a fisherman throwing a net. The loop opened as it flew toward the tangle of limbs and movement at the center of the platform. His plan was simple: land the loop on the ground near the tyrant's feet, wait for one of them to step through, pull the chain tight around an ankle, let the wagon do the rest. The plan failed, spectacularly. At the last moment, Mountain King flinched backward, and the loop didn't fall to the ground at all. It landed around the creature's neck. A second later, it pulled tight. An iron noose. Sonny stood completely still for a moment, not trusting what he was seeing, then clenched both fists at his sides, barely containing the urge to throw them into the air. He turned back to check on the wagon, and went paler than he already was. Shifty and Scholar had pulled the wedges and were pushing, but the wagon was barely moving, rolling far slower than he had calculated, far, far slower. He turned back to Mountain King. The creature, startled by the sudden weight at its throat, was already reaching up with both enormous hands to tear the chain free. Sonny ran. He reached the wagon and threw himself against it alongside the other three, pushing with the remains of what had already been a badly beaten, badly depleted body. "Roll! Roll, you creaking piece of garbage!" The wagon picked up just a little speed. The edge of the cliff was still too far away. At the same time, the tyrant closed its grip on the chain and began to pull. Now it came down to a single question. Which would happen first? The chain breaking or the wagon going over the edge?